Greetings, fellow book detectives, to a new case of literary intrigue. Grab your magnifying glass as we uncover the secrets hidden within the pages of Wuthering Heights by Emily Brontë. Liking this video lets me know that I'm on the right track, and subscribing following my channel ensures you won't miss any future content. And hey, if you're feeling chatty, drop a comment below and let's start a conversation. Chapter 1. Mr. Lockwood, Mr. Heathcliff's new tenant, narrates the beginning of Wuthering Heights. The year is 1801. Wuthering Heights is the name of Mr. Heathcliff's home. The term wuthering is used to describe the amount of wind a property is subjected to during big storms. Mr. Heathcliff, rather reluctantly, has invited Mr. Lockwood into his home to show him around and talk about their arrangement. Upon entering Mr. Heathcliff's home, Mr. Lockwood notices the name Hareton Earnshaw and the date 1500 etched into the stone surrounding the front door. Mr. Heathcliff's unfriendly and hurried manner causes Mr. Lockwood not to ask about the relevance of the name or date. Mr. Lockwood is left alone with several of Mr. Heathcliff's dogs as he goes to fetch his butler and a bottle of wine. Mr. Lockwood makes faces at the dogs and they attack him. Mr. Heathcliff and his butler return and the dogs leave Mr. Lockwood alone. He has not been bitten or otherwise injured. Mr. Heathcliff is amused by the event and his mood thus improves. The pair shares some wine and conversation. Chapter 2. Mr. Lockwood arrives at Wuthering Heights the next day to call on Mr. Heathcliff. Just as he is knocking on the door, it starts to snow quite heavily. He begins to pound loudly, but no one opens the door. Finally, a young man without even a coat on appears and leads him into the house. There, Mrs. Heathcliff is sitting before the fire. She is not very friendly to Mr. Lockwood and refuses to serve him tea, as Mr. Heathcliff had not invited him for tea. The mood is awkward as Mr. Lockwood unsuccessfully tries to engage her in conversation. Mr. Heathcliff finally arrives. He is angry with Mr. Lockwood for visiting in the middle of such a storm. Mr. Lockwood suggests that Mr. Heathcliff either lend him one of his servants to guide him back home or otherwise let him stay the night. Mr. Heathcliff is not agreeable to either suggestion. The young man, Mrs. Heathcliff, Mr. Heathcliff, and Mr. Lockwood sit down for tea. The three inhabitants of Wuthering Heights are angry and quite curt with each other and their guest. Mr. Lockwood makes the mistake of identifying Mrs. Heathcliff as Mr. Heathcliff's wife. Mr. Heathcliff tells him that she is his daughter-in-law. Mr. Lockwood then misidentifies the young man as Mr. Heathcliff's son. He is quickly corrected by both Mr. Heathcliff and the young man, who identifies himself as Hareton Earnshaw. Mr. Heathcliff's son, Mrs. Heathcliff's husband, is dead. No other information is given. There are no men available to guide Mr. Lockwood back to his house, and Mr. Heathcliff insists that if he is to stay, he must share a bed with one of the men of the house. Mr. Lockwood is angered at their lack of hospitality. It is now that the dogs choose to attack him once again. Zillah, the housekeeper, enters the room and rescues Mr. Lockwood from the dogs and Mr. Heathcliff and Earnshaw's laughter. She tends to his wound and tells him that she will lead him to a place he can stay the night. Chapter 3. Zillah warns Mr. Lockwood not to make any noise or light the lamps, as Mr. Heathcliff does not let anyone go into the room that she leads him to. Mr. Lockwood finds an old-fashioned cabinet. Mr. Lockwood finds an old-fashioned cabinet, like room within the room. It's not a normal bed. The cabinet affords its user privacy without giving them their own room. He opens the cabinet, finds a bed within, and shuts the doors. In addition to the bed, there is a small nightstand and lots of books. Mr. Lockwood pages through them and notices that the owner of the books has written in every blank space. The books had belonged to Catherine Earnshaw. Mr. Lockwood reads passages that Catherine had written when she was a small child. Her father had left her and Heathcliff under the charge of her older brother, Hindley, and his wife. Hindley Earnshaw did not think Heathcliff was their equal and treated him poorly. Mr. Lockwood drifts off to sleep and quickly falls into a deep nightmare. He screams in terror, waking himself up. Heathcliff rushes into the room to investigate the noise. He is not angry to see Mr. Lockwood in the room. He only wishes that he would not scream again. Mr. Lockwood then tells Mr. Heathcliff that Catherine was tormenting him in his nightmare. She was pleading with him to let her in through the window. Mr. Lockwood remembers too late that Catherine had written kindly of Heathcliff in her books, and they seem to have been friends. Heathcliff is noticeably angered by Mr. Lockwood's comments. He tells Mr. Lockwood to leave the room and join him in a couple minutes. Mr. Lockwood is unsure of where to go and sees Heathcliff go to the window and plead for Catherine to come back. Heathcliff is in tears. Dawn arrives, and Mr. Lockwood walks back to his house. Chapter 4. Mr. Lockwood is curious for gossip about Heathcliff, so he talks to his housekeeper, Ellen or Nellie, who has lived there for 18 years. Mr. Heathcliff is a very rich man who could afford to live in the grander Thrushcross Grange, but chooses to rent it out and make even more money. Heathcliff's son is dead, and his young widow's maiden name was Catherine Linton. Hareton Earnshaw is Catherine's cousin. The housekeeper tells Mr. Lockwood that she used to play with Catherine and Hindley, and she was there when their father, Mr. Earnshaw, had brought home a little homeless boy. The boy was not well received by the rest of the house, including the housekeeper. However, in only a couple days, he and Catherine were good friends. Hindley never liked him. Chapter 5. Nellie continues telling her story. Mr. Earnshaw had grown ill. He could not bear the fighting between his son, Hindley, and Heathcliff, so he sent the former to college. Catherine was a very pretty but very mischievous little girl. Her best friend was Heathcliff, and she spent most of her time with him. Mr. Earnshaw passed away in his chair. Catherine had been at his feet, and Heathcliff lay in her lap. Catherine had sung to her father, and he slipped into death without anyone realizing what had happened. When they finally did, everyone was stricken with grief. Catherine and Heathcliff comforted each other with their descriptions of what heaven was like. Chapter 6. Hindley comes back home for the funeral and brings with him his wife, whom he had kept a secret. Hindley is mean, spirited, and condemns all of the servants to the back rooms. He also turns Heathcliff into a servant instead of one of the family. He is no longer allowed to learn with Catherine, and he has to do manual labor in the fields. If either Catherine or Heathcliff disobeyed Hindley, which they often do, they are disciplined. One day, the pair runs off and cannot be found when the housekeeper calls them for dinner. Hindley locks all of the doors and ordered the servants not to let them in. Nellie has stayed up to watch for them. It is only Heathcliff that comes back. Catherine is staying the night at Thrushcross Grange. The Lintons, who live there, did not ask him to stay. Heathcliff describes the scene he and Catherine had witnessed at Thrushcross. The two children, Edgar and Isabella, had everything they could want. A warm fire, plush room, but instead of being happy, they were fighting with each other over the dog. Catherine and Heathcliff began laughing at the children, and the Lintons harred them. The dogs were sent out, and one of them bit Catherine's ankle. A servant dragged them both into the house. They believed Heathcliff to be a gypsy and sent him outside to walk home by himself. They doted on Catherine and allowed her to stay the night. Chapter 7. Catherine ends up staying at Thrushcross Grange for 5 weeks. In those 5 weeks, her ankle healed from the dog bite and she grew into a little lady. When it comes time for Catherine to return to Wuthering Heights, Heathcliff's pride would not allow him to clean up. He had grown resentful over the friendship that she developed with Edgar and Isabella. When Catherine sees her old friend, she makes a comment about his unwashed appearance and laughs. Heathcliff is angered that his friend, who used to play with him, has changed and has laughed at him. Nellie tries to convince Heathcliff to improve his appearance, and finally he agrees. The Lintons are coming over for a party, and Heathcliff promises to be a good boy. Heathcliff is clean and presentable, ready to meet his old friend and her new friends, but Hindley steps in and sends him to the tower. During the party, Catherine sneaks off to talk with Heathcliff. Nellie realizes the late time and apologizes to Mr. Lockwood for talking so long to tell the story. Mr. Lockwood tells her that he likes the long-winded version and is quite curious over all of the details of the characters in the story. Nellie then continues the story where she left off. It was the summer of 1778. Chapter 8. That summer, Hareton Earnshaw, Hindley's son, is born. Hindley's wife is stricken with consumption and dies when Hareton is still a baby. It is Nellie's responsibility to raise him. Catherine is 15. She is very beautiful but selfish, and Nellie does not like her. Having been denied an education for so long, Heathcliff had fallen behind in his studies compared to Catherine. He is reduced to manual labor and no longer believes in himself. Catherine and he are still friends, but he shrinks away from her touch. Edgar has started calling on Catherine and Nellie and is ordered by Hindley to stay in the room on such visits. Catherine does not like this and shows her true character to Edgar by pinching and verbally abusing Nellie in front of him. Edgar tells Catherine he will leave, but he turns around and continues his visit with the young beauty. Chapter 9. Hindley's drinking has increased since his wife's death. Nellie grows accustomed to hiding Hareton and removing the bullets from Hindley's rifle on nights he has been drinking heavily. One night, Hindley catches Nellie trying to hide Hareton in the kitchen cabinet and accuses her of trying to kill the young boy. He threatens her life and takes the child away. Hindley brings his son upstairs and Nellie follows. The three hear steps below. Nellie recognizes them as Heathcliff's. Hindley loses his grip on his son and he falls to the ground. Heathcliff catches him just in time. Nellie knows that Heathcliff realizes that by saving Hindley's son, he had missed his opportunity at the greatest revenge. Nellie believed that if they had not already saw Heathcliff save the child, he would have smashed it upon the ground himself. Nellie took Hareton down to the kitchen to calm him. Heathcliff was going to the barn, but instead chose to sit on a bench, hidden and quiet. Catherine joined Nellie, wanting to talk to her. She told Nellie that Edgar had proposed and would not tell Nellie whether or not she accepted until the housekeeper gave her opinion on what she should have done. Nellie questions whether she loves Edgar. Catherine tells her yes. Nellie asks her why she loves Edgar. Catherine says she loves Edgar because he is handsome, kind, wealthy, and that he loves her. Nellie tells her that these are not reasons why one loves another person. Catherine then tells her that she does not think she should marry Edgar. She tells Nellie that if her brother had not diminished Heathcliff's standing, then she would have married him, but now it would degrade her to do so. She tells Nellie that she loves Heathcliff, not for the reasons she loves Edgar, but because they are so much alike that he is more like herself than she is. Nellie sees Heathcliff when Catherine is talking. He silently exits the room after hearing that Catherine feels it would degrade her to marry him. Heathcliff never heard Catherine confess her love for him. Catherine goes on to tell Nellie that she will marry Edgar and use his influence and money to build Heathcliff's standing so that he may be more powerful than Hindley. Nellie tries to persuade her that her reasoning is wrong. She tells Catherine that Heathcliff likely heard much of what she had just told her. Catherine goes to find Heathcliff in the barn, but he is not there. In fact, no one can find Heathcliff. Catherine stays up pacing and throwing a crying fit. She is outside when a terrible storm occurs. She refuses to move inside until after the storm has passed. She is soaked through and settles herself on the settee. She is still sitting there the next morning, still damp. Catherine falls ill with fever. Mr. and Mrs. Linton also fall ill with the same fever and die. 3 years later, Catherine marries Edgar. Heathcliff has not returned. Nellie is forced to leave Hareton and accompany Catherine to Thrushcross Grange. It is then that Nellie realizes the late time. She tells Mr. Lockwood that he had better go to bed and that she will continue the story at a later time. She remarks that Mr. Lockwood does not look so well. Chapter 10. Mr. Lockwood has been ill, confined to bed for 4 weeks. He is beyond restless, and so he asks Nellie to come in and continue her story. She continues where she had left off. Nellie accompanied Catherine, now Mrs. Linton, to Thrushcross Grange. She notices that both Isabella and Edgar try hard not to make Catherine angry and for the most part bend to her will. One night, Nellie is returning from the garden and hears her name called. At first, she does not recognize the voice or the man behind it, but soon he identifies himself as Heathcliff. Heathcliff is very polite and asks Nellie to fetch Catherine for him. Nellie does as she is asked. Catherine returns with great excitement that her old friend has returned. Heathcliff is invited inside for tea. Catherine spends the entire time staring at Heathcliff, and he steals frequent glimpses of her. Edgar is angered at the visible flirting going on between his wife and a man he still considers beneath himself. Before Heathcliff goes, he mentions that he will be staying at Wuthering Heights at the invitation of Hindley. Nellie is awakened that night by Catherine, who is too happy to be awake alone. Nellie wonders at the strangeness of Heathcliff staying at Wuthering Heights. Catherine tells her that Heathcliff had explained it to her. He had gone to Wuthering Heights to see Nellie in order to find the whereabouts of Catherine. Hindley had some men over for a game of cards and Heathcliff was asked to join. He did and won quite a sum of money from Hindley. Heathcliff was invited for another game and finally to stay at the house in exchange for rent. Heathcliff told Catherine that he wished to stay there so he will be closer to Thrushcross Grange and therefore her. Edgar allows Catherine to visit Heathcliff at Wuthering Heights accompanied by Isabella. Heathcliff also begins visiting Catherine at Thrushcross Grange. Isabella developed an intense crush on Heathcliff. She resented Catherine for not including her in conversation with him and one day told Catherine so. Isabella confessed that she loved Heathcliff. Catherine tries to convince her sister-in-law that Heathcliff would be a bad match for her. Heathcliff arrives the next day for a visit. Catherine and Isabella are in the same room, yet have not spoken to each other since their fight. Catherine reveals Isabella's feelings for Heathcliff, and they both laugh at the young woman. Chapter 11. One way, Nellie had a bad feeling about Hindley, as if something was going to happen to him. She goes to Wuthering Heights to see her former master. There, she runs into Hareton, her former charge. The little boy swears and throws things at her. Upon her inquiry, the boy tells Nellie that Heathcliff has taught him those words. He tells Nellie that he likes Heathcliff because he curses at his father, and his father had sent away his tutor, whom he did not like. Heathcliff has begun his revenge on Hindley by turning his son against him, and teaching him bad behavior. He has also forced the tutor away, leaving Hareton uneducated. This is the same thing that Hindley had done to Heathcliff as a boy. The next time Heathcliff comes to visit Thrushcross Grange, Nellie notices that he calls on Isabella before finding Catherine. Nellie tells Catherine that Heathcliff had turned his affection toward the young girl. Catherine confronts Heathcliff. She asks him if he truly has feelings for Isabella. Heathcliff tells Catherine that she has treated him as though he was beneath her, and it has not gone unnoticed. He tells her that he will use Isabella's feelings for him to his advantage. While they are fighting, Edgar finds Nellie and tells her to bring in a couple men at his signal. He enters the room where Catherine and Heathcliff are fighting and orders them not to see each other anymore. He accuses his wife of having feelings for Heathcliff. He gives his signal to Nellie to find the other men, as he will not fight Heathcliff by himself, but Catherine sees the signal and locks Nellie in a closet. Edgar begins to tremble and leaned over a chair. He is unable to face Heathcliff alone. Heathcliff calls him a coward and moves toward him. Just then, Edgar springs up and punches him in the throat before running out of the room. Heathcliff leaves, and Catherine locks herself in her room. She refuses any food that night or the next morning. Edgar tells his sister that if she continues to pursue a relationship with Heathcliff, then she can no longer consider him her brother. Chapter 12. On her third day of fasting, Catherine asks for some water and food. Nellie brings her water and toast, which she finishes quickly. Catherine throws a temper tantrum. She is acting crazy and is furious that her husband is not worried for her. She is talking nonsense, and it turns out that she has a fever. Edgar passes by the room and is mad that he has not been alerted to her illness, but no one had known that she was sick since she had locked herself in her room. Nellie goes to find the doctor. Catherine is quite ill. One of the maids, back from an errand in the nearby town, brings with her news of Isabella's departure in the night. She has run off and married Heathcliff. Edgar responds to the news by telling Nellie that Isabella is no longer to be considered his sister. Chapter 13. Catherine was very ill for the next 2 months, until finally the doctor announced that she was out of danger. It was soon announced that she was pregnant. Heathcliff and Isabella were still unaccounted for. Approximately 6 weeks after Isabella left, she sent a short note to her brother informing him of her marriage. She also included a note for Nellie's eyes only. In the letter, she tells Nellie about her first couple days at Wuthering Heights, where the newly married couple has settled. Everyone at Wuthering Heights has been quite unwelcoming towards her, and Heathcliff has turned nasty. She believes that Nellie has been correct in her judgment of his character, and that she has made a mistake in leaving Thrushcross Grange. She pleads in her letter to Nellie that her former housekeeper will visit her often. Chapter 14. Nellie pleads with Edgar to forgive his sister and write her a note that she may take with her to Wuthering Heights, but he refuses. When Nellie arrives at her former house, Heathcliff greets her looking very much the gentleman. Isabella looks unkempt, an outward signal of the neglect she has been given. Heathcliff asks Nellie questions about Catherine. She tells him that she has gotten over the worst of her illness, but she will never be the same person in appearance or character. Nellie tells Heathcliff not to try to communicate with her. Heathcliff explains passionately to Nellie that he loves Catherine more than any man, including Edgar, ever could, and he knows that Catherine still loves him. He tells Nellie that he will once again see Catherine. Nellie tells him that such a meeting might kill Catherine. Heathcliff informs Nellie and Isabella that he never loved his wife, Isabella. In fact, he has never met anyone as detestable to himself. as her. She had conjured up feelings of love for him that were completely one-sided, and once they were married, he tried his best to make her hate him, and he succeeded. He had even hung her doll. At the end of his speech, he gives Isabella permission to leave, as he'd rather her annoying presence be gone, even if it meant giving up the pleasure he took from tormenting her. Isabella tells Nellie that he has given her permission to leave before, only to revoke it. Heathcliff proves her right by ordering her to her room. Heathcliff then sets his sights on convincing Nellie to help him see Catherine. He wants to hear from her why she had fallen sick, and if there was anything he could do. Heathcliff found this the best way to be done with the uncertainty. Nellie finally allows herself to be convinced to give Catherine a letter from Heathcliff and inform him the next time Edgar leaves the house. Mr. Lockwood's doctor arrives at Thrushcross. As Nellie goes to meet him, Mr. Lockwood thinks of Catherine Heathcliff and her eyes. He wonders that if he falls for her, will she turn into her mother? Chapter 15. It is now a week later. Mr. Lockwood is feeling better and recounts what Nellie has told him of her story since she had last left off. Nellie carries the letter from Heathcliff to Catherine, but does not give it to her until 3 days later, when Edgar and the rest of the house leave for church. Heathcliff, as he promised, is waiting outside in the garden. Catherine has a glaze to her eyes that will not allow her to focus on anything nearby. She looks lost as her mental illness is getting the best of her. After reading the letter, Nellie can tell that she has not comprehended anything. Nellie has to explain that Heathcliff wants to see her. Before she can finish explaining, Heathcliff enters the house of his own accord and finds Catherine's bedroom. The two embrace fiercely and cover each other with kisses. The look in Heathcliff's eyes shows his belief that Catherine is indeed dying. The two confess their love for each other and apologize for betraying the other. They embrace, kiss, and weep for some time. Soon it is time for Edgar to come home. Nellie warns that he is near and can hear his footsteps. Heathcliff tries to extricate himself from Catherine's embrace, promising to come back within the hour, but she will not let him go. She faints as Edgar enters the room. The two men forget their hatred for one another long enough to tend to Catherine. Heathcliff leaves to spend the night below, in the garden. Chapter 16. The Catherine that Mr. Lockwood knows is born that night. Catherine Linton dies 2 hours afterward. Baby Catherine is born unwanted. Edgar is grieving the loss of his wife, and the little baby girl is not considered an heir. The next morning, Nellie finds Heathcliff waiting out in the garden. She only confirms his statement that Catherine is dead. He asks how she died and is answered that it was quietly. Heathcliff voices his hope that Catherine haunts him because he cannot live without her. She is his life, his soul. He violently bangs his head against a tree. Catherine's body is laid out in the parlor until her funeral. Edgar stands watch over her body, hardly sleeping. When he finally seeks rest, Nellie opens the window so that Heathcliff, who has also been standing guard outside, can say one last goodbye to his love. Chapter 17. During one stormy evening, Nellie is rocking baby Catherine, whom her father calls Kathy, while Edgar sleeps upstairs. Isabella enters the house, soaking wet. She gives her account to her former housekeeper on the recent events at Wuthering Heights that have caused her to leave in the middle of a storm. The night before, Heathcliff found himself locked out of the house by Hindley. Hindley confessed to Isabella that he planned to kill Heathcliff that night, and all she had to do was remain silent. Although Heathcliff had broken Isabella's heart, she could not stand by and watch a man be killed, even if it was him. She warned Heathcliff of Hindley's intentions. Heathcliff gained entry into the house, and the two engaged in a physical fight. Hindley was wounded, but not mortally. The next day, Heathcliff was once again mourning the death of Catherine to Isabella. She provoked his anger by teasing him about Catherine, and he threw a knife at her head. Isabella turned and ran all the way to Thrushcross Grange. She has finished telling her story to Nellie, and so she leaves in a horse and carriage that has been prepared for her. She does not believe that Edgar will let her stay in the house, and she is never going to go back to Heathcliff. A couple months after she leaves, Isabella gives birth to a son, Linton. Finley dies less than 6 months after his sister Catherine. He drank himself to death. Hindley mortgaged Wuthering Heights very heavily to pay for his gambling and drinking. Heathcliff owned the mortgage and now was the master of his childhood home. Edgar had wanted to take custody of Hareton, but Heathcliff threatened that, if he tried, he would subsequently try to gain custody of his own son. Edgar relented, and so Hindley's son, Hareton, would become Heathcliff's servant. Chapter 18. The next 12 years are very happy for Nellie, or Ellen, as she is now called, and the other inhabitants of Thrushcross Grange. Cathy is growing up to be a beautiful, sweet, yet spirited young lady, and Edgar and Ellen both adore her. Edgar, however, has become somewhat of a hermit, and thus, so has Cathy. She begins to become curious as to what lay outside their property. It was around this time that Isabella passed away. She had written to Edgar telling him that she did not have much time left, and she wished for him to raise Linton. Edgar rushed to his sister's side and stayed for 3 weeks. To occupy Cathy during that time, Ellen allowed her to go out on the property with her pony during the day. She would come back and tell Ellen of her adventures, making up great stories. One day, however, Cathy does not come back at tea time as she is supposed to. Ellen's search leads her to Wuthering Heights. Cathy meets Hareton and mistakes him for the owner's son. When she is corrected, she treats Hareton like a servant. Ellen explains to her that Hareton is her cousin. Cathy does not believe this as she feels Hareton is below her. Heathcliff had forced the boy to do hard labor and had robbed him of use of a tutor. Chapter 19. Edgar brings Linton back with him to Thrushcross Grange. Cathy is quite excited about the prospect of having a real cousin to play with. Linton is a very weak boy. That night, one of Heathcliff's servants arrives at Thrushcross demanding that they give him Heathcliff's son. Edgar promises that he will be brought to Wuthering Heights the next morning. Cathy is not to be told where Linton has gone. Chapter 20. Early the next morning, Ellen delivers Linton to Wuthering Heights. Heathcliff is surprised but disappointed that the boy is so fragile and looks nothing like him. He assures Ellen that he has already readied a room for his son and employed a tutor. Linton is to be master and has the right to give orders to any of the servants, including Hareton. Chapter 21. Cathy is very sad when she realizes that Linton has left. Ellen knows the housekeeper who is employed at Wuthering Heights, and so she is able to get information concerning Linton. He is still a sick, weak boy and not a very grateful patient. His nature is to complain. Heathcliff dislikes the boy. On Cathy's 16th birthday, she and Ellen go for a long walk. Cathy runs ahead, and before Ellen can catch up with her, she has run into Heathcliff, who has mistaken her for a poacher. Heathcliff convinces Cathy that he has someone he wants her to see, someone she has already met. Cathy insists that she go, and Ellen has no choice but to follow. Cathy is surprised to discover that Heathcliff is Linton's father. She questions the fact that neither Edgar nor Ellen had allowed her to see Linton when he had lived so close. Heathcliff tells Cathy that Edgar had not liked the fact that he married his sister. He tells Cathy that she and her father are welcome anytime. Heathcliff explains to Ellen that he wishes for his son to marry Cathy, for then his son will also be the heir to Thrushcross Heights. Linton, at first, does not pay much attention to Cathy. Heathcliff employs Hareton to show Cathy the property, then sparks Linton's jealousy so that he may take over the task. Linton and Cathy both make fun of Hareton's lack of education, apparent in his speech and his lack of ability to read. The next day, Cathy told her father of her visit to Wuthering Heights. Edgar explained the real reason he kept Cathy from that place is that Heathcliff was a bad man. He tells Cathy that she is not allowed to visit Linton. As the weeks go by, Ellen suspects that Cathy and Linton have been secretly sending notes. She confirms her suspicion by unlocking Cathy's desk drawer one night while Cathy is sleeping. She reads the childish declaration of love in the letters and removes them. The next afternoon, Cathy discovers her drawer is empty. Ellen threatens to show the letters to Edgar, but agrees to burn them if Cathy promises to stop the letters. Chapter 22. Edgar falls ill with a cold, and Ellen takes Cathy out on her daily walk. They reach a wall with a door that goes out to the road, and Cathy climbs the wall. While reaching for a flower, her hat falls off. She scales the wall and is at once on the other side. She cannot climb back over, and Ellen does not have a key for the door. Heathcliff approaches Cathy and tells her that Linton is dying from a broken heart because she has stopped her letter writing. He tries to convince her to come to Wuthering Heights and visit Linton, but Ellen breaks the lock and escorts Cathy back home. The next day, Ellen accompanies Cathy to Wuthering Heights. Cathy is worried for Linton's health, and Ellen wants to show Cathy that Heathcliff is telling another lie. Chapter 23. When they arrive, Linton is yelling for a servant. He is not in a good mood and is full of complaints. Ellen assists the weak boy without thanks. Linton is ungrateful, but Cathy is kind to him. The boy then tells Cathy that her father is evil, and she retaliates by telling him what her father had said of Heathcliff. Cathy gets so angry that she knocks his chair. Linton is so weak that he rattles in the chair. He makes Cathy feel bad for hurting him and calls her names. Cathy felt very bad and tried to make him more comfortable. He complained and made her promise that she would visit him again because she had hurt him so that she must make up for her actions. That evening, Ellen caught a cold and had to stay in bed for 3 weeks. Cathy tended both her father and Ellen during that time. She was the best nurse they could have had. Chapter 24. Ellen becomes well enough to move around the house and finds that Cathy is not in her bed. Ellen waits until Cathy returns and she confesses that she has been visiting Linton during the evenings while Ellen and Edgar slept. She tells Ellen that on one of her visits, Hareton told her that he had learned to read and write. When he told her he did not know his numbers, Cathy laughed at him. Ellen scolds her for acting cruel, and Cathy continues telling her about all of her secret visits. The next day, Ellen tells Edgar about the visits. Edgar tells Cathy that she is not to go to Wuthering Heights again, but that he will write and invite Linton to visit Thrushcross whenever he liked. Chapter 25. Ellen explains to Mr. Lockwood that the events she describes have only happened 1 year ago, and yet so much has changed. Edgar becomes sicker, and Cathy spends all of her time at his bedside. Edgar wonders to Ellen why his nephew, Linton, has never visited. Ellen hides from Edgar Linton's unhappy and complaining character. She also does not tell him the extent of Linton's physical incapability. She does tell him that if Cathy were to marry Linton, she would always be the stronger half and would therefore not suffer any abuse. Edgar tells Ellen that he would rather see Cathy die with him than marry Linton. Ellen promises to watch after Cathy and be with her until she, herself, dies. Edgar writes to Linton, and the nephew does write back. His letters lack the negative attitude that he has in person. Ellen tells Mr. Lockwood that she later learns that Heathcliff told his son what to write through his letters. Linton tries to convince Edgar to let Cathy visit him. Edgar does not relent, but does invite Linton to visit Thrushcross. Chapter 26. Edgar finally allows Cathy to visit with Linton in between both properties. Ellen goes with Cathy and finds Linton much closer to Wuthering Heights than he had promised. Linton is in much worse health than when they had last seen him. He is so sick that he cannot concentrate on anything that Cathy says. Cathy wishes to leave, but he begs her to stay, explaining that he is fearful of his father. He tells her to tell Heathcliff that he was in good spirits and was looking very healthy. Cathy agrees to stay a while longer, and Linton dozes off. When he awakes, Cathy reluctantly agrees to meet again next week before Ellen and her leave. Chapter 27. Cathy and Ellen reluctantly keep their promise to visit Linton the next week. Cathy is upset at having to leave her father's bedside and demands an explanation from Linton. It does not seem as if he really wants to visit with her. Linton confesses that his father has threatened him and that he should be killed if Cathy does not consent to marry him. Just then, Heathcliff arrives. He orders Linton to get up. Linton tells his father that he cannot. Heathcliff offers Cathy support and tells him that she will surely help him home. Cathy does not want to go against her father's orders, but she also cannot refuse her cousin when he is so weak and fearful. The four walk back to Wuthering Heights. As they enter the house, Heathcliff locks them inside. Cathy yells at Heathcliff and tries to get the key. He hits her in the head several times. Heathcliff leaves the room to make tea. Cathy and Ellen plead with Linton to help him. Linton is looking a little better, betraying the fact that he had faked his fainting spell in order to lure Cathy to Wuthering Heights. He explains that he is to marry Cathy the next morning, and the two will stay the night at Wuthering Heights. Linton will not help either Cathy or Ellen, as his marriage to Cathy secures his safety from Heathcliff. Cathy and Ellen were sent to a bedroom to spend the night. The windows were too narrow to climb through. Neither of them slept. The next morning, Heathcliff removed Cathy from the bedchamber. Hareton arrived later with a day's worth of food for Ellen. He feeds her each morning this way, and for the next 4 nights, she is locked in the room. Chapter 28. The 5th morning, the housekeeper Zillah opens the door to her bedroom, surprised to see Ellen. Zillah had been away and had heard that both Cathy and her were missing and believed to have fallen into the marsh. When she arrived back at Wuthering Heights, Heathcliff explained that they had been found and had been staying there. Zillah was under the impression that Heathcliff had saved the pair. Ellen leaves Zillah's room and goes to find Cathy. She finds Linton instead, lounging in front of the fire, sucking on some candy. He tells Ellen that they will not let Cathy leave, and everything that she had is now his. Linton seems quite pleased with himself. He will not tell her where Cathy is being kept and waves her away. Ellen leaves Wuthering Heights and goes to Thrushcross Heights. Upon hearing Ellen's account of Heathcliff's capture and his daughter's forced marriage, Edgar calls for the lawyers to change his will so that Cathy may be assured of her money when he dies. Ellen sends servants to Wuthering Heights to fetch Cathy and to the village to fetch the lawyer. Both groups return empty-handed. They were told at Wuthering Heights that Cathy was too sick to travel and the lawyer had business to attend to and would be there tomorrow morning. That afternoon, Cathy arrived at Thrushcross Heights. Linton had finally given her the key to make her escape. Edgar died in his daughter's arms. The lawyer did not arrive until after Edgar's death, and it turned out that Heathcliff had paid him to do so. The lawyer fired all of the servants except for Ellen. Chapter 29. It is after Edgar's funeral that Heathcliff arrives at Thrushcross Heights. He takes Cathy back with him, but makes Ellen stay to take care of the new tenant. As Cathy was packing her things, Heathcliff tells Nellie that as the sexton was digging Edgar's grave, he paid him to open Catherine's grave so that he may look at her. He also paid the sexton to bury himself with Catherine when he dies. Heathcliff tells Ellen that he will be happy when he dies because he will be able to lie next to Catherine and their bodies will decompose together. He also confesses to her that he had tried to dig her up the night of her funeral 18 years before, but before he could get the coffin open, he had felt her presence. Catherine had haunted Heathcliff many times since. Chapter 30. Ellen had not seen Cathy since she left Thrushcross Grange. She got her information from Zillah. Cathy spent her time at Wuthering Heights caring for Linton. Then one night, he died. Linton had left all of his property, which was once Cathy's, to his father. Zillah had also told her that she did not like Cathy for she found her too haughty. Hareton, on the other hand, showed some fondness for Cathy, although he did not know how to express himself. This is the end of Ellen's story. Chapter 31. Mr. Lockwood is feeling much better and decides to move out of Thrushcross Grange and spend the next 6 months in London. He goes to Wuthering Heights to tell Heathcliff his plans. Mr. Lockwood promises that he will continue paying rent for the full year, as agreed upon, but that Heathcliff may find himself another tenant. While he is at Wuthering Heights waiting for Heathcliff, he passes a letter from Ellen to Cathy. Cathy tells him that she would like to write back, but she has no paper. She has even been denied books. She confesses that she had searched Hareton's room and found some books. She tells Mr. Lockwood and Hareton that the books are wasted on him as he does not know how to read well. Hareton removes the books from his room, offers them to Cathy, and upon her denial, burns them. Chapter 32. It is September of 1802. Mr. Lockwood finds himself near Thrushcross Grange while traveling. He decides to visit his old home. When he arrives, he finds that Ellen no longer lives there. He has the new housekeeper ready, a room for him while he goes on a walk. Mr. Lockwood walks to Wuthering Heights. He decides that he had better pay Heathcliff the rest of the rent that he owes as he does not think he will be in the area anytime soon. As he arrives at Wuthering Heights, he notices that it looks much more inviting and not closed off as it was on his last visit. He arrives at the front door and through the window sees a young man and woman. The woman is teasing the young man for reading a word wrong. She tells him that he must try again until he has no mistakes. The young man finishes the passage and is rewarded with many kisses, which he returns. The couple walks toward the door, presumably out for a late stroll. Mr. Lockwood does not want to interrupt them, so he walks around to the kitchen door. In the kitchen, he finds his old housekeeper, Ellen. Mr. Lockwood tells Ellen that he has come to settle his rent with Heathcliff. Ellen informs him that he is dead. She has Mr. Lockwood sit down as she tells the rest of her story, from where she had left off the last time. Soon after Mr. Lockwood left Thrushcross Grange, Heathcliff summons Ellen to come to Wuthering Heights. Cathy is happy to have Ellen back with her, and Ellen is too happy to be back with Cathy. For the most part, Cathy keeps company with Ellen, but when the housekeeper has work to do, Cathy amuses herself with harassing Hareton or trying to get him to talk. Cathy would not leave Hareton alone. Cathy begins to realize that Hareton does not wish to speak to her because she has laughed at his attempts to educate himself. For several nights, Cathy had tried to get Hareton interested in the books she has been reading by leaving them out open. Hareton does not take the bait. Finally, Cathy confronts Hareton and apologizes for her past behavior. She wishes for him to be her friend. Hareton believes that Cathy hates her, while Cathy believes that Hareton hates her, while Cathy believes that Hareton hates her. Hareton explains that he has taken her side in battles with Heathcliff. Cathy had not known this. She wrapped one of her books as a gift and gave it to Hareton, telling him that if he accepted the gift, she would tutor him on how to read it. The friendship between Hareton and Cathy grows very fast in its intimacy. Ellen is looking very much forward to their wedding day. Chapter 33. Hareton and Cathy are studying together one night as Ellen watches proudly. Heathcliff enters and sees the pair. The pair leave the room and Heathcliff begins speaking to Ellen. He tells her that he has schemed all of this time to destroy Wuthering Heights and Thrushcross Grange, and now that it is in his power to do so, he has no desire to finish his plan. Heathcliff tells her that, as he does not have the will to destroy the two houses, he also finds it hard to summon the will to eat or sleep. He wishes to die, but fears that he may grow to be. Chapter 34. Heathcliff continues his strange behavior. One night, he stayed out until morning. No one knew where he had been. He began the habit of only eating one meal a day. He had even started smiling when he was usually snarled. One evening, Ellen goes to check on Heathcliff. He is dead on his back, and the rain is wetting his body through the open window. The doctor does not know what he died of. Heathcliff is buried as he wished, next to Catherine. It is now said that Heathcliff haunts the moors. One evening, as Ellen was making a trip to Thrushcross, she ran into a little boy who swears that he saw Heathcliff and a woman. Ellen informs Mr. Lockwood that after Hareton and Cathy marry on New Year's Day, they will all move to Thrushcross Grange.